to the Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent and reverse brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a functional medicine physician in Cleveland, Ohio, and your host on this journey. So, whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have loved ones with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's and dementia. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page, or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. So here we go. Let's get better. Welcome back to the show. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Michael Lewis, an expert on brain health and prevention, treatment, and management of brain injuries. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel and was influential in many of the policies of the United States military and its approach to traumatic brain injury. Since retiring from the Army, he founded the Brain Health Education and Research Institute just outside Washington, D.C. He is the author of the recently published When Brains Collide. I have read this book in its entirety, and it is phenomenal. The reason we wanted to bring him on our show is because there appears to be a lot of crossover, like we've talked about in other episodes, with traumatic brain injury and the physiologic consequences that take place after that and how they relate to the brain in Alzheimer's disease. So welcome, Dr. Lewis.
Well, thanks, Dr. Bergman. It's a pleasure to join you.
And thanks for being here. You know, one of the other ways you've distinguished yourself, as you well know, is an expert not only in traumatic brain injuries and concussions, but also in the field of omega-3 fatty acids, so to be fish oil and algal oil, which we can get into more. And you have developed an omega protocol, which is just phenomenal. I was telling you earlier that I have many members of my family now on high doses of omega-3s, and we're seeing a variety of results. It's really interesting, and it's early on. It's been only about a week that we've been doing it, but very, very interesting. I thought I'd at least share that with you.
It's good. It's not always just for injured people, but in some ways, have challenged healthy people to just try it to see, and I'm always surprised at how much of a difference it makes in just everyday life, even somebody that doesn't have a head injury.
Absolutely. You know, the one other thing I wanted to tell you, I did my residency in Kansas City, where one of the affiliated hospitals was a hospital called St. Luke's, right in Kansas City, Missouri. And for many years, this is the home of Dr. William Davis, Bill Davis, of omega-3 fish oil fame. He's developed a lot of technology and assays and things like that have allowed us to quantify omega-3 levels. He's a prolific researcher, written dozens and dozens of original peer-reviewed medical research articles. But his inner circle still there that still remembers him affectionately calls him the Codfather. I never met to meet Dr. Davis because he had left just a couple years before, but I love that the Codfather term. So in terms of your entree into the field of brain health and concussions, I know you initially went to undergrad and then at West Point, did military service, and then went back to medical school, Tulane. But how did you find yourself, and at what point, a nice long 31-and-a-half-year career in the Army, when did you find yourself engaging in brain health and concussions and omega-3s, and how did you end up there?
Well, through a string of events, I intended to be a surgeon, and at the time, the Army would send you out and do general practice for a couple of years, and I discovered nights and weekends, like what surgeons don't know anything about. And so I just couldn't go back after a surgical internship a couple of years later to do my residency. And so I did a residency in preventive medicine and public health instead, and got involved in infectious disease and things like that, and got assigned to Bangkok, Thailand. So my job for a number of years was to run around Southeast Asia looking for new and interesting diseases. I was a disease hunter. And after a while, the Army said, you got this great experience, come back and teach at the medical school in Bethesda. And so I found myself on the grounds of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in the middle of a war. And so you can't help on the Walter Reed campus to be around wounded warriors. You go to the gym and there's guys running on a treadmill with missing a limb or two, or going to the weight room and exercising. So they're all around you, and you start to think, what am I doing to help with the war effort? Infectious diseases, of course, are very important. But I really got to thinking, and about the same time, the Saco coal mine accident happened in West Virginia in early 2006. And the one guy that survived severe carbon monoxide poisoning and multi-system organ failure was barely alive and mostly brain dead. And they were left with, what can we do to help his brain? And they tried high doses of omega-3 fish oil. And short of the story is he walked out of the hospital a couple months later and started hearing about this story and kind of put two together, came up with an odd number, went to the head of research at Walter Reed and said, is anybody looking at high doses of omega-3s to help with the recovery from traumatic brain injury? And the answer was, no, why don't you? And that's how a career changes. So I jumped on board and started teaching myself and learning who knew what and networking and talking to the world's experts on the area. And I found out that a couple weeks later that I was the DoD's expert. And it was very much a learn on the job process.
Absolutely. It sounds very familiar. So many situations I found myself in throughout my life, thrown into it from asking questions. I don't know if it's an irony, Mike, or not, but since I really learned of you, even before we met, a couple of people in my life have experienced concussions, one of which was just this morning. A coworker of mine walked in and she had gotten knocked on the head. She didn't pass out, but knocked on the head really good by one of those arms on that protect a parking lot, and nearly knocked out. So she just came to work and got her CAT scan and was sent home to rest for a couple days. A story about a month ago with one of my brother-in-laws. So we were back at home for a vacation, and he was riding a bike and wearing a helmet and doing all the right things. And my father's cell phone rang with sort of a strange call from a lady we didn't know saying that there was a guy mumbling and moaning and disoriented out on one of the bike paths in Kansas City, where I'm from, and pick him up. And my father and my sister, his wife, got there, had seen his face was all scraped up, his shoulders scraped up, but he was amnestic. He had some amnesia and confusion and repeating statements and unaware what the day was. It really reminded me of one of my dementia patients. Of course, they took him to the emergency room, did a CAT scan of his head, which is the standard of care, and saw that there was no bleeding. So he was released home with some anti-nausea medicines. And that was kind of it from a medical standpoint. But he had noticeable short-term memory loss for a day or so, headaches and nausea for 36 hours, approximately a day and a half after the accident. And then he seemed to get back to normal. Now, I don't know if what's going on internally is really normal, but can you describe to us what was going on in his brain in sort of the short term? And then long term, what can happen to somebody that is concussed, that has a concussion? What's going on physiologically inside the brain over time?
Well, you bring up a couple of different points. You did a great job of describing, sort of your classic concussion, and some of the short-term things, amnesia, disorientation, could be balance issues, and so on. And that's typically a result of what we call the primary injury, that initial impact. And so if you think about a concussion as being a bruising of the brain. So, you come to a sudden stop because you fall off a bike or slip in the shower or hit your head playing sports or whatever the case may be. Your skull stops, but your brain keeps moving. And, it keeps moving inside the skull and that bath of water that it's in, the cerebral spinal fluid, and it hits the inside of the skull because it's going to keep moving until, basic physics, until it's acted on by an outside force. And that brings up two things. One is that's that bruising that can happen at the impact, and the brain can reverberate and the contra coup kind of damage that we often see where there's bruising 180 degrees on the opposite side of the brain. But it's also the idea that the brain is not a bowl of jelly or a yolk sitting in an egg. It's much more complicated than that. And there's different parts of the brain that are different densities. And so they're going to come to a stop at different rates. And that stretches and pulls and tears the connections between these different parts of the brain. And if it's severe enough, it's what we call the diffuse axonal injury. And that is going to get into the whole secondary injury or the secondary response after that primary injury. And that's this long, could be drawn out biochemical cascades that continue to cause damage for minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, even decades after an injury. And if you think about it in terms of sort of inflammation, it's, you have the inflammation because the body needs to repair itself. So all the inflammatory markers go flying into the area to help with the repair. But if we don't resolve that inflammation, we end up in a state of chronic inflammation. And that's one of the theories that I've got why we see, like NFL football players decades after they stop playing, that they're having a higher incidence of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, chronic traumatic encephalopathies, the big one that we hear about these days, CTE. But what happens in those 20 or 30 years? And what's happening is that's inflammation that just continues to kind of burn like a smoldering fire through the brain, continues to cause more damage.
Yeah, so one of the definitions of inflammation that I really like is sort of the inability to heal, with chronic inflammation. Other things that are known in concussions, oxygen deprivation, reactive oxygen species, all of which have a role like in the short term, but like you're saying, in the long term, if these other things are prolonged, they're not resolved, that seems to be sort of the big risk for damage downstream. It brings up an interesting point that we've thought about it quite a bit, which is if as a result of a concussion and this sort of coup counter coup, this concussive force that you mentioned, if there is any breakdown in the blood-brain barrier, that thin surface that separates the brains and the brain fluid from the rest of the circulating blood and really protects it. It's typically pretty tight, but can a concussion break or make permeable or make leaky the blood-brain barrier, effectively creating sort of a leaky brain?
Well, there's two or three different things we could do with that. One is, that initial injury can be sufficient enough, and probably almost always is sufficient enough to cause some kind of a break, hopefully localized, of the blood-brain barrier. It can happen. It doesn't mean that it will or always does. And so in the short term, it's likely that there's a break in the blood-brain barrier. In the longer term, one of the things I get concerned about is, researchers at University of Virginia about 2 years or so ago described a lymphatic system in the brain that we had never really known about before. And so if you've got inflammation going on in the brain and it's not being able to be drawn out of the brain, the toxins and the protein buildup and so on, if the lymphatic system has been damaged and you can't get all that bad stuff out of the brain, that can lead to buildup of, we hear about tau and tauopathy, beta amyloid, and so on. And I think that there may be a correlation with damage to the brain's lymphatic system and the development of some of these longer-term degenerative diseases.
Absolutely. So you're talking about tau and amyloid beta or beta amyloid and all things that are very known, sort of the usual suspects in Alzheimer's, which is additionally interesting to me because when you talk about inefficiencies in the lymphatics or the lymphatic system of the brain, and also then things like sleep become important, because if you presume that the lymphatic system is there to sort of take out the trash in sleep, and adequate oxygenation at nighttime, of course, it plays an additional role in the taking out the trash, as it were, for folks that have the beginnings of neurodegeneration. In fact, there's some correlates between Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. There's some theories that have been floated for the last 4 or 5 years that perhaps just like Parkinson's, an early symptom of Parkinson's, a decade or more in advance might be constipation. sleep issues, so problems with sleep architecture, sleep disruption, well, of course, doesn't mean that someone has impending Alzheimer's, but may be an early sign of some of the networks in the brain degenerating. So I'm always asking now, did somebody have a head injury? Did they play football? Did they play sports? Did they play women's hockey? Anything like that, because it seems to be so much more important. As a follow-up on that, in your book, you make the point that the ApoE4 gene, which of course is a much higher risk for the development of Alzheimer's, whether somebody has one copy or both copies, is also an indicator of higher risk for having difficulty recovering from head injuries or more severe symptoms if an injury like a head injury would occur. Do you know anything specific about what predisposes these folks to worsening injury, like these ApoE4 folks? I know a lot of our listeners definitely at least have one copy of ApoE4.
Well, as you stated, ApoE4 has a correlation of whether or not people recover. I think that's probably a bigger issue than what we realize. Concussions are like snowflakes. Every single one of them is very different from one person to the next person. And it's the variability of concussions and how people recover is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to research. It's been a little bit interesting. You have to figure that genetics plays a part somehow. But also, I think you have to realize that it's also your environment. There's the toxic environment, exposures to toxins and so on. But the one that I decided I was going to focus on was more of the nutritional environment. And that can have a profound influence on how we deal with inflammation. And it gets back to the simple concept of you are what you eat. And our American diet isn't so good these days.
Absolutely. So that's so interesting. I recently have seen a couple of folks that had one copy of the ApoE. One gentleman had one copy, one had two copies. And in both cases, they had known histories of concussions. Both were really into sports. I was telling you about one of them who was a high school and college football player. And there is a theory out there, I think first proposed by Dr. Caleb Finch at USC in particular, who maintains from an evolutionary biology perspective that the ApoE4 status seems to be more associated with a pro-inflammatory state, meaning it's pro-oxidative, it's persistent oxidative stress and inflammation. And to your point, these folks that so far what we think we see, the folks that have one or both copies of ApoE4 seem to respond quicker to the resolution of inflammation, through a variety of things. Nutrition, of course, wants sleep. And on that note, I know you've written extensively on the role of omega-3 fatty acids in the recovering brain. Your book really does a wonderful job at setting the scene and the whole picture. But can you just tell us, what is an omega-3 fatty acid? What's its role in the brain? And do we actually have omega-3 fatty acids in our brain?
Well, most people just don't really know much about the brain. It is complicated. And, the term fathead, it's got a lot of truth to it. Our brain is made up of mostly fat. And about 30% of those fats are what we call omega-3s. And it has to do with the chemical structure, not worth trying to get into. But we also have other fats. You've got the two most important fats in my mind are omega-6s and omega-3s. And they're really meant to balance each other. Both are important to develop a brain, to make a brain in the first place. And mankind developed with an even, parity between the omega-6s and the omega-3s. Omega-6s are stiffer. They don't oxidize as easily, so they're much different than omega-3s, which, if you think about it, we use omega-6s and from vegetable oils and soybean oil and so on to process our foods because it's very shelf stable. It doesn't spoil. Whereas you put a fish out in the sun for an hour and it's going to be spoiled really bad. So omega-3s are not very stable. But our bodies were designed to be in balance. And over time, particularly in the last 50, 60 years, our diet, our food supply, and everything about the way we eat has really become skewed so that there's so many or too many omega-6s, in some cases 20, 25, 30 to 1 ratio to omega-3s, where these omega-6s are very pro-inflammatory and are completely out of balance with the resolving omega-3s. So the pro-inflammatory and the anti-inflammatory are just out of balance. And so that's why I talk about the nutritional environment of what a person is dealing with. My theory is that you're at much greater risk of a head injury, of getting one in the first place, or having problems with a head injury after one occurs. And I think that even extends to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases, that if we have too many omega-6s and not enough omega-3s, I think we're at greater risk.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Can you summarize the way you think omega-3 fatty acids help an injured brain? I know you go into it in really a lot of detail in the book, but in general, is it just about resolution of inflammation and having the building blocks? Is there anything? Is it more complicated than that? Is there anything that's critical other than resolution of inflammation and getting those sort of building blocks of omegas into the brain?
Well, you have to realize the omega-6s and the omega-3s are like bricks in the cell membrane. And so they're an integral part. And so I kind of throw it as, hey, it's like a brick wall. If a brick wall gets damaged, don't you want to use bricks to repair the wall? Omega-6s are like bad bricks and omega-3s are good bricks. So you probably want to use good bricks to repair your wall. And so DHA in particular, the longer, the 22 carbon chain omega-3, is an integral part of the cell membrane as a arachidonic acid in the omega-6 is. But you are what you eat. So our bodies and our brains reflect our diet. And so if we're consuming too many omega-6s and not enough omega-3s, that literally is reflected down to the cell, the neuron cell membrane. And so when the processes happen, the biochemical processes happen, if the source of all the downstream effects is skewed because there's too many omega-6s, and that's going to be more of the inflammatory processes, it becomes an unfair fight. People say, so DHA, that's what we find in the brain, so that's more important. Well, EPA, the 20 carbon chain one that's kind of known as the heart healthy one, is really important too, because it has an influence on not just the eicosanoid pathways, which help with the resolution of inflammation, but EPA also can influence the nitric oxide system so that the relaxation of the blood vessels so that you get blood flow deeper into the brain, as well as the anti-inflammatory effects. Some great scientists, of DHA, for example, resolvins and neuroprotectants. And that's what they're called, and that's what they do. And I think that was a great way to describe it.
Absolutely. When you look on the back of a fish oil bottle, like omega-3, like say Nordic Naturals or another good brand, you will see, let's say, 1,600 milligrams of omega-3s. And then it'll say amount of DHA, 500 milligrams. It'll say EPA, 800 milligrams. So that gives you 1,300 milligrams of EPA plus DHA, but then there's like another 300, and some other bottles have more of sort of other omega-3 fatty acids. Are those, should we care about those? Are those important? What are those?
Well, the process of the way our bodies are designed is that we typically take in like leafy green vegetables and stuff like that, or flaxseed and so on. You take in these 18 carbon chain omega-3s and the counterparts on the omega-6 side. And the process to elongate them to 20 and 22 and 24 carbon chains and to create double bonds and stuff like that, they're called elongases and desaturases, enzymes that are involved in that process. Our bodies were designed with just one way of doing that. And it was meant to be that done in a balance of omega 6s to omega 3s. So if we're at a balance 25-1, omega 3s don't get elongated into the longer chain omega 3s like DHA. So some of those other ones, DPA and some other omega 3s, for example, we don't know if there's some belief that there might be some biological activity to those. And it's kind of hard to imagine that there wouldn't be. But certainly we know the most about EPA and DHA. And so some of those are just intermediate steps in between.
I see. So I guess the next question would be, okay, so I know EPA and DHA are critical. Can we measure them? I mean, how can people check their level of omega-3? Can you check your omega-6? Can you get this sort of ratio? Are there important numbers that we should be shooting for in terms of the omega-3s, the omega-6 to 3s?
Well, that brings up a really, really important point. Everybody, pretty much you could ask anybody, how's your cholesterol? Most of the time they'll know the exact number of their cholesterol. And so, we've done over the last 40, 50 years a great job of making it important that you know what your cholesterol levels are. But we can do the same thing with omega 3s, omega 6 to 3 ratio, for example, and we can test it with blood. I would love to see a world in which that's the number that you know what your omega-3 index is, because it's probably more important than your cholesterol. It has a greater implication for heart disease, but also for brain health, obviously. And so if you can measure it, you can do something about it. And so if your doctor does a measurement of your omega-3s, and it actually would be a fatty acid panel or fatty acid analysis. And the way that we look at the omega-3s and the omega-6s and some of the subsets there is we typically look at it as a percentage of your total fatty acid profile. And so it's a zero-sum game. So the more omega-6s that we have, the ratio to 6 to 3 is going to be skewed. So where we were meant to be 50-50, 50%, 50%, for every at 70% omega-6s, we're basically at 30% omega-3s, and it just keeps going in that direction. So you can get it measured. Most labs can measure it. And in fact, low omega-3 levels are a dramatic risk for heart disease, and I would argue also for brain degenerative diseases down the line.
Yeah, so what's like when somebody gets a result and it says, oh, I got my omega check or my omega quant or my omega-3 index checked in, they get a number that's 3.4. Is that good? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? And it's like, it says, there's like a yellow check mark or a red check mark indicating that it should be higher. Is it like a number that people are shooting for that's healthy?
Well, an omega-3 index of greater than 10 is really, really good. Now, I take a lot of fish oil, and last time I checked mine, I was around 14 or 15. Most people, if we were to take a cross-section of the United States and look at people, they're going to be, unfortunately, they're going to be down around somewhere between, 2 and 6%. And so you really want to get that omega-3 index into double digits to be on the better side of things.
And how about the omega-6, the sort of inflammatory omega-3 fatty acids the omega-6 fatty acids that are, of course, important, but only in the right ratio? Is there a ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s that we think is ideal?
Well, ideally, that ratio should be less than 5-1. So 5 omega-6s to every omega-3. And that would be really good. 3-1 would be even better. Like I said, our bodies were designed to actually be in balance, so 1-1. And that's a really, really difficult. You'd have to be eating fish day and night, and it would be very close unless you're an Eskimo and that's all you eat. So that would be really tough. But, certainly 5-1 would be really good. That puts you in a much healthier state. And when I say healthier state, it's your heart health, your risk of cardiac disease, your risk of having a heart attack goes dramatically down the better your omega-3 status is. But it's also your mental state. And so If somebody is not getting enough omega-3s and they have way too many omega-6s, the 25, 30 to 1 type of thing, that's typically those people that are struggling mentally. They have a lot of brain fog. Cognition's not as good as it should be. I've got a friend at the NIH. He says, junk food equals junk brain. I take the positive approach. I say healthy food equals healthy brain. And so you really are what you eat.
I'm with you. I couldn't be with you more. Speaking of food and food quality, can you speak about the quality of fish oils available in the United States and worldwide, but particularly in the United States? Why is it so important to pick a good company, and why does it cost so much? And what do you say to people that are trying to, quote, save money and get like $9 bottle of omegas? Like, are they still getting some benefit?
Yes, they are still getting some benefit, but it's clearly one of these things where you get what you pay for. And so you could get cheap fish oil and it's going to make a little bit of a difference, but it's not going to make a big difference. And you increase the likelihood that, with some brands that they may be mislabeled. They may not actually have the omega-3s in them that they claim to have, and there might be more toxins and heavy metals and things like that if it's not manufactured the right way. So the really quick concept of manufacturing is you squeeze a fish basically and you get omega-3s, you get EPA and DHA mainly, in triglyceride form. And what we do is we break that glycerin backbone, and now you have the free fatty acids, and you have to combine it. Like sodium needs chloride to make salt. So they have to be bound to something. And so what we do in manufacturing process is we bind it to an alcohol molecule. So now you have a fatty acid combined with alcohol, and that's called an ethyl ester. And basically that's how you separate the good stuff from the bad stuff. So you take this ethyl ester and you extract that and get rid of the PCBs and heavy metals and toxins and so on. And that's that molecular distillation to clean it. And most fish oil companies will do that. That's pretty standard practice these days. So now what you could do is you can concentrate that, so that you have more omega-3s in a smaller amount. But it really takes a huge amount of expertise to be able to reverse that process and put those omega-3s back into a triglyceride form. That's the way our bodies were designed to digest it, is the triglyceride form. That's what's easily digested. Our bodies don't know how to digest ethyl esters. That they're a new chemical entity that it's only been around 20, 30 years. And our bodies don't know how to digest it evolutionary wise. And so it's really important. The type of fish oil I look for is I want it clearly stated that it's triglyceride form. If it doesn't say it's triglyceride form, it probably is not. And I typically recommend that people get a concentrated triglyceride form so that the number of capsules that you need to take is less. It may cost more, but in the end, if you actually measure it price per milligram of EPA and DHA, you're probably actually saving money by going with better quality anyway.
Yeah, and you go into great detail in terms of companies you trust and brands you trust in the book. And I don't want to make this too much about one company or the next, but there's definitely, that book has a lot of really practical information. How about
one of the really interesting things that I don't think I say in the book, but basically 85% of fish oil comes through one European company. And they're the supplier for 85% of all fish oils. There are good brands out there. They mostly, you can trace them back to the same place. So that's actually in many ways a good thing.
Yeah. In your book, you really speak of taking doses that, if you're not familiar with omegas and the process here, some people might find quite high. One of the commonest criticisms of high-dose omega-3s, and I know you've faced this criticism in clients and patients you've consulted with, is, well, you can't give them that oil because it leads to bleeding. Can you speak about what really the evidence is for bleeding on fish oil?
Well, I'll speak to evidence and I'll speak to clinical experience. So if you look I've challenged every so-called expert that I know to show me a single study that shows that bleeding is an issue with omega-3s, and nobody's ever really been able to do it. And so it's theoretical, and I won't say that it doesn't happen. So if you're taking a really high dose of fish oil, it's probably similar to if you were taking an aspirin a day. And we have no problems telling everybody over 50 or over 55, you should take an aspirin a day. Well, you think about, somebody that's taking an aspirin a day, they're going to bruise a little bit easier because their blood's not going to clot as easy. Well, taking high doses of fish oil is about the same as that. It's not anywhere near as bad as taking something like Coumadin or warfarin or some of these other pharmaceutical blood thinners that completely eliminate the ability of your blood to clot. So fish oil doesn't do anything like that. Yet it gets a bad rap that it does, but there's absolutely no scientific evidence that it actually really does have that an issue. And in fact, there's been studies that show given heparin or Coumadin in the emergency setting of traumatic brain injury actually lowers the risk of complications. And so why would fish oil do anything different is beyond me, and it actually has the opportunity to help the brain, not just stop the blood from clotting. And my clinical experience, I've had some patients have been on really high doses, even higher than what I recommended for years. I've got one lady, severe car accident. She's been on much, much, much higher doses of fish oil than I would have been trying to get her husband to decrease the amount for about 7 years.
Wow.
And never had an issue.
Wow. Why does she take so much? I mean, what compels her to take so much?
Well, the husband's sort of the belief that, well, if some helps, more is going to help more.
Yeah.
And
famous last words. Yeah, right.
It's been hard sell to convince him that you can cut back on it. She's completely saturated. What I need to do is get some blood levels on her and prove to him that she's getting plenty of fish oil now.
Yeah, that protocol is fairly detailed. Dr. Lewis in the book has 3 different pages in the chapter on the omega-3 protocol, giving you all the details and doses and weight bases and for kids. And it's fairly complicated, and we don't have to get into all of that, but these are high doses. I mean, what I would consider a nutritional dose is 1,000 milligrams, maybe 2,000 milligrams, and then FDA, I think mostly less than 3,000 milligrams or 3 grams of combined EPA and DHA. And in the book, it's talking about doses that are considerably higher than that.
Well, I don't advocate that people do that for long. I respect what the FDA says, but I want to saturate the brain as quickly as possible. The studies show that it takes 12 weeks of decent dose of fish oil to saturate the brain. But when somebody's got an injury, do you really want to, have a 3-month process, or would you rather kind of get them back to health a little bit quicker? And that's my approach. And so I really kind of take more of a loading dose approach to it. And that's why I start with the higher doses. So I triple the dose, or if they're unconscious in a coma and you're using a feeding tube, I double that even more. So it's 6 times that FDA recommended dose, because I want to saturate the brain as quickly as possible to give the brain the best chance to heal after an injury. But I don't advocate that people stay on that high dose for very long. I say as soon as we can, we want to get you down to that FDA recommended dose.
Traditionally, omega sources, come from fatty fish like salmon, sardines, anchovies, maybe herrings, tuna, if you think they're clean and relatively mercury-free. In your book, you tell a really interesting story about how NASA came to use algae forms of omega-3s, basically where the fish get them from, is how it seems. Without going...
Well, your fish don't natively have omega-3s. They actually have to bioaccumulate, whether it's eating smaller fish or at the bottom of the food chain. It's like cows eating grass or lamb, sheep eating grass, and fish eat algae. And that's where they get their omega-3s, and then they elongate and desaturate. And, so it's a bioaccumulation by the time it gets to our part of the food chain that's well established. But when NASA was trying to figure out how to get to Mars in 3 years without any fresh food in a space capsule, they figure out, well, what is it that we need to keep people healthy and alive? And one of those things was omega-3s. And somebody had the audacity to actually ask the question, where do fish get their omega-3s? And the answer is algae. And so they set out to figure out what types of algae have the highest amounts of EPA and DHA and that. And then they canceled the program. But luckily, the scientists was too good. And so they got some venture capital money and started a company. And that was around 1986. And it took them until about 2002 to actually get to market with this algae-based DHA. So basically, they grow it in like million-gallon tanks and express the oil or extract the oil from the algae in like million-gallon tanks. And so around 2002, they were able to finally get to market, and their big market was actually infant formula. And so as a result of that NASA program, back in the early 80s, 100% of today's or 99% of today's infant formula sold in the United States has algae DHA supplemented into it because it's so important for the development of the child's brain.
Wow. So is there any downside? I mean, I know I have numerous vegetarian, vegan, mostly vegan patients that really don't, for ethical reasons or a variety of reasons, really don't want to use any animal products, including fish. And often we're recommending algal forms. Is there any sort of downside to using an algal form versus if the fish oil have an advantage over an algal form? Or does the algal oil have any health advantage over a fish form?
Well, let me just categorically state that there's really no substitute for nature. And the real most correct answer is we should be eating good quality fish, like you mentioned, multiple times a week because of that whole food effect. When you extract the fish oil and you refine it and so on, you lose some of those different things that are of eating the food of fish. You lose some of that entourage effect that you get with the whole food. So algae versus a fish oil, the number one answer is eat fish, eat real fish, but we don't do that. And particularly Americans, we don't do it. And vegans obviously don't do it. And so vegans can have some of the worst omega-3 levels ever recorded. I mean, you talk to any lab guy that does omega-3 indexes and stuff, and they're like, worst are the vegans. And it's amazing if you give a vegan an algae oil in decent doses, it's like, wow, I didn't know I was supposed to think this clear. I mean, it's really like, being in a dark room and turning on the light. And so they really, really respond even to the algae-based omega-3. So I think it's important. It's probably more important in vegans than it is in your carnivores.
That's so interesting. There's another, speaking of, variants, there's a new product on the market, and it seems like only a couple companies are sort of making this available. They seem very promising. They're called specialized pro-resolving mediators, SPMs. Some of the research, Dr. Charles Sirhan at Harvard and his group just talked about the resolution of inflammation. These seem to be at least in terms of the latest and greatest science, these seem to be important players in that sort of resolution, short-term resolution, whether it's weeks, a month, or more of inflammation. Can you speak at all to the products that are now available on the market that are marketing themselves as specialized pro-resolving mediators or SPMs? Is there any caution there? I mean, what are they getting?
Well, we talk about EPA and DHA and their downstream biochemical cascades. So when they're released from the cell membrane, what are those chemical cascades that they lead into things called, eicosanoids and docosanoids and resolvins and protectins and neurosins and all these different down in the weeds biochemical stuff. So SPMs are actually really interesting. They're many steps down the cascade, But the supplement SPMs are literally just one step down from EPA and DHA. So they're actually not specialized protective mediator, whatever the SPM stands for. I always blank on that. But they're actually not SPMs. They're precursors to the SPMs. But then again, so is DHA and EPA. So is fish oil. So is eating fish. It's all precursors to the SPM. So it's a little bit of marketing, a little bit of mislabeling. Not to say that they're bad. I think they're just making claims that are preying on the ignorance of 99.9% of the world. I mean, unless you do this for a living, you wouldn't know that.
Sounds like marketing.
That's marketing. That's the same thing with krill oil. The reason why krill oil was really big a few years ago, was because of marketing. And when a company bought the big krill oil company and they said, wow, we're spending so much money on marketing, let's cut that in half, krill oil sales dropped by 50%. So, because, their marketing was cut in half.
Yeah, wow. So, to all our listeners, in his book, When Brains Collide, Dr. Lewis describes really a lot of what we talked about in great detail with some scientific references, and really gives you an interesting inside scoop on a lot of the high-level discussions he's had in the U.S. Armed Forces, and kind of his story on the fight to bring this to soldiers and defenders of our nation, and now to the general public. So thank you so much for being here and to your contributions to this field, Dr. Lewis.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to reach out to your listeners, and hopefully it'll make a difference in a couple of people's lives. I just have to say about the book, you can find it on Amazon, or you can track it through whenbrainscollide.com. What I really want to say about the book is it's about people. It's about hope. And so I use a lot of patient stories so that somebody that's been struggling for months or even years with the problems of a concussion, and they're just at the end of their rope because they just don't see how they're ever going to get better, I mix in stories of people like that so that to give the reader hope that, one of the things that I joked to you about before we were on the show is, we don't do anything different than what we did 500 years ago. We tell people to go sit in a dark room for a couple of weeks and they'll get better. And a researcher friend of mine said, "Oh, that's not true." And I'm like, "Really?" And she goes, "No, it's been at least 1,000 years."
Yeah.
So we don't do anything different, and I wasn't willing to accept that. I have a surgical mentality. I want to fix things. And I saw that, the book is a culmination of getting all that information out of my head and out to people. And so I tell people it's a book about hope, that there is more we can do, that you don't have to go sit in a dark room for a couple of weeks, but you can actually be proactive and do things to help your brain
Really
health.
appreciate the contribution. Thank you so much for your time and being here. So that's our episode. I hope you guys got something out of that. Check the show notes out on iTunes or on our website where we've summarized the key points. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page. Or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. Finally, if you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comments section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. Thanks, and talk to you next time.